Okay then, last time around we took a look at the East Power Rankings for May, going into the June Joust, which is just around the corner. It's the next weekend from this one, and now we're going to take a look at the West. The West has 12 teams, and this is where things are a little weird, because this is going to look very different to the Power Rankings I had prior to the season starting, because some teams have done much better than expected, some teams have actually, well, not done as well as expected. So this is going to be vastly different to what I originally predicted, and, you know, that's fine, because we were going into a season, and I reiterated this a lot, that it was fairly unknown. So many new rosters, so many changes, we didn't really know who was going to come out on top. Even changes to the shock, which have proved rather interesting, shall we say. So, we're going to go from bottom to top, and this bottom team is rough. This is London. Now, I really wanted to put Vancouver bottom, I'm not gonna lie. But, despite being a fan of London, I still think that Vancouver have shown more promise than London. A bit more balance in their play. London, hybrid has been mediocre. They have been extremely aggressive, which worked for them in EU contenders, but is not working anymore because they're getting punished by pretty much every team they go up against, apart from Boston fully. So then it's just becoming an almighty slugfest. Like, London, I think, will significantly improve when Sparker becomes of age. But Sparker is not becoming of age until June, so they're still going to have to wait a tiny little bit. I still think this London team has to push a little bit more, and it will be better than Vancouver and Boston in their current states. However, things may change at Boston when they get Gabe Bulsey in the side. Fusions is around now as well, I believe, or we've seen him hanging around on their Twitter and stuff with Gabe Bulsey. So Boston exists and may start to improve the same pace as London start improving, and so it just becomes, they're always behind, basically. So, firmly, London look like one of the bottom two right now. However, that could change with time. They could become as good as Paris, but Paris again have shown much more promise than a lot of people would have expected. So that's something else we have to take into account. So obviously, as I've just mentioned, Vancouver are just above them. Vancouver, they've done better than expected. I'll give Vancouver a lot of credit. They're this team that can take maps off of some of the best teams in the league. Like, they've taken a map off Florida. But then, when they come up against Paris, they still lose 3-1. How can you lose 3-1 to Florida, but also lose 3-1 to Paris? In essence, if you're taking maps off of the likes of Florida, Toronto, and people like that, how can you not either take Paris extremely close or beat Paris? If you can take a map off Washington, why can you not beat Paris, even if it's just 3-2? And this is what's weird about Vancouver. I think they're going to be a team that plays up to their opponents, but is never enough. And that's going to be really, really unfortunate for them. So that's why they're second from bottom, and they're just below Paris. I have put Paris below everyone else, though, which may be a little bit of a surprise, considering in the actual standings right now, Paris are above Boston. This is only on map differential, though. And something we have to take into account for Boston is the fact that they've played Dallas and been swept. They've played Gladiators and been swept. And they've also played Washington, but they took a map off Washington, which is promising. They did, however, get taken to 5 maps by London, which, again, if you take a map off Washington, you don't expect to be taken to 5 maps by London, but anyway. There's improvement for Boston, and that's why I put them above Paris. Now, you know, Paris is so weird, because they're doing better than I expected, because I thought they would be worse than the other EU team, otherwise known as London. They did get a good 3-1 victory over Vancouver. London needs to do the same when they meet Vancouver, otherwise they're going to be in serious trouble. But when Paris have come up against the likes of Houston and Atlanta and people like that, they've fallen completely short. Weird thing is that they came up against the Atlanta side that basically says, yeah, we're going to sweep people that are below us, but we can't do anything against people that are higher. So they get a 3-0 there. That's the only 3-0 that Paris have taken this season so far, because they've taken maps against Florida, and they've taken a map against Washington. So, against Houston, sorry. So, again, promising for Paris. Much similar situation to Vancouver. However, I think there's perhaps more potential in Paris than there is in Vancouver. That may seem weird to say. Vancouver got Terror, right? But I think Paris are in a bit better of a position right now. However, Paris have just changed Neptuno for Dredro. And that's going to be... That's going to be interesting. That's going to be very interesting. I think that'll breathe a bit more life into Paris. But I'm not sure whether it'll improve them. Dredro is a good player. He's been one of the good main supports in the EU. But that's in the EU, not the best main support, because I would say the best EU main support you could pick up right now is Admiral Raptor, who is a British Hurricane. So, yeah, it's an interesting pickup, but it does mean that Paris lose some of that really old hat leadership of Neptuno, which is gonna suffer. I think they're gonna suffer for that in the short term. I'm not gonna lie. As much as I don't think Neptuno is that great of a pickup, and wasn't that great of a pickup, I do think they're gonna suffer for a little bit. I do think that. So Boston just above them. Boston, they're gonna improve a lot, as I said. So, Boston, I don't trust them. And the reason I don't trust Boston is their really whack-ass coaching staff. Because they've got Laurie, right? That makes sense. But then they've got Baroy and Ascoft, a German and a Frenchman. Like, that just doesn't line up to me whatsoever. It does not line up to me. Considering Laurie has spent his entire career, I believe, coaching in Korea. So, it just doesn't make sense. I think there may be a disjointed coaching lineup at the Boston Uprising, I'm not going to lie. And I think that's what's going to make them suffer most of all. Because they're not a bad team in terms of its players. Like, they've got Stand One, who was on Shanghai last year. Yeah, he wasn't the starting main tank for Shanghai, but still made appearances. And then you've got, you know, good players available. Punk isn't that bad, although he's not great. You can have Gabe Bulsey available. You've got a really good support line, actually, in Faith and Myungbong. And you've got good DPS available to you. And then you've got the backup main tank fusions and stuff like that. You've got a lot of potential, I would say, in the Boston Uprising. And that's why I think a lot of people were high on them coming into the season, but it just never turned out, which is really weird. And that's why I don't think they're going to push much higher than where I put them in the power rankings, which is fourth from bottom of North America. Atlanta are just above them. So, Atlanta, they are gatekeepers, and I think will be for a long time. They have, I would say, again, similar to Boston, a really high skill ceiling with the players they have, but never realize it because of the coaching they have, and therefore they end up in this mid-table position guarding the gates to the top teams. Or to the top half of the league, shall we say. As we've seen, Atlanta, they can go sweep Paris, which is great. That's what you want to see Atlanta do. But then, when they take on the teams above them, the likes of, the Florida Mayhem and the Toronto Defiant, they end up losing out. And then they take someone like the Shot Close. It's like, there's so much inconsistency, it is ridiculous. And that's why Atlanta, they don't push much higher than where they are. Because they're held back by mediocre coaching. And that's just, yeah. That is just rough. For Atlanta, I'm not going to lie. Because they've got so much potential to be higher. And that must pain Atlanta fans. Just above Atlanta, middle of the group in NA, we've got Toronto Defiant. Again, Toronto are the bottom of the top. That's what I regard them as. They are bottom of top tier. Because Toronto, they've got great players in my opinion. They have got okay coaching. okay coaching. I don't think their coaching is the best from KDG, not gonna lie. But again, they have the potential to be a lot better, but they're not reaching that potential. And they're getting taken a little bit too close by people like London. Like, dropping a map to London is rough from a Toronto point of view. And then they're getting absolutely pummeled by someone like Washington. And you don't want to see that. With the quality of players that Toronto have, they shouldn't be getting pummeled by Washington. They should be able to at least put up a really good fight against them. But at the end of the day, Toronto are getting taken closer by the bottom half of the league than they are taking the top half of the league, which is rough. When you've got... This was a relatively easy stage for Toronto when you look at it. They played London, which was a 3-1 for them. They played Washington, which was a 3-0 for Washington. They played Atlanta, which was a 3-2 for Toronto. And then they played Vancouver, which was a 3-1. They dropped a map against every single team that was below them, but they could not take a map off Washington. That tells you that Defiant are middle of the league, if not just very high bottom half of the league. And based on those results, as soon as Defiant get a stronger schedule, which they did not have in the May Melee, they are going to suffer. However, in this coming June Joust with Reinhardt banned, we now know the hero pools, that could be a big benefit for Toronto, because there could be more Winston, and therefore that would be a benefit to them. But we'll have to keep an eye on that and see what happens. Just above then, the Los Angeles Gladiators are going to sit in their place. Los Angeles Gladiators have disappointed in this first May Melee tournament, I am not going to lie. I thought they would do better, but they lost 3-1 to Dallas, they lost 3-1 to San Francisco. They did sweep Boston in a nice recovery and London in week 2, which got them fairly nice placing. However, they need to start doing better. I think this Gladiators side have the ability to take Shock and Dallas much, much closer than they did in week 1. However, week 1 can contain a lot of erroneous results, so we have to take that into account. But I think the Gladiators could do much, much better than what they are doing right now. And therefore, I don't feel like I can rank them much higher. You know, there's Flock. I've just completely merged Shock and Florida. But Florida, Shock, Houston, Washington, and Dallas are all above Gladiators. And that's because the Gladiators, in my opinion, I think will either get taken extremely close and probably lose to all of the teams above them in my power rankings. And that is a surprise to me, because I didn't think that was going to happen coming into this season. I thought Gladiators would be one of the best teams and up with a lot of Washington. And they're not, which is unfortunate. But it also shows, perhaps, how Moss wasn't... the Moss situation is so difficult, because we're going to talk about Shock in a minute. And he's had an impact on Shock, leaving, not going to lie. Just above Gladiators, we have the Florida Mayhem. They had a really great May Melee. A really great May Melee, but they ran out of gas in the May Melee and lost really heavily to Shanghai Dragons. Now, this is perhaps rather low for the Florida Mayhem, but that's because I still believe there are a lot of teams better than Florida. And when Florida took on Vancouver, they dropped a map. When they took on Atlanta, they dropped a map. When Florida took on the big boys, though, when they took on San Francisco Shock, they got pasted. In a week where Atlanta took the Shock so close, and then later on in those days, Dallas completely dumpstered them and dumped them out of the May Melee knockouts. So it raises alarm bells for me with Florida. I think the biggest test in this June Joust, which considering the hero pool is probably going to be favourable to them, considering Reinhardt is banned, less rush, that's what Florida were weak on. Although the meta favours them, I think the big test in the June Joust is if in these 3 weeks coming up of fixtures, will they maintain the quality of Overwatch they've been playing in the knockouts of the May Melee? Because if they do, they will do extremely well. If they don't, which I have a feeling they won't, because they burnt out in the May Melee, which was quite obvious when they got swept by Shanghai, they ran out of ideas. When that happens, they will start to fall off. And that worries me about Florida. OG has got to keep up the performances he's been having. If he doesn't, it will be rough for Florida. However, I do think a lot of the teams above them are quite strong, with the exception of the one just above them, And I can't believe that, because that's Shock. Shock are in 4th. And Shock, they disappointed. They did not make it to Hawaii. They did not go to Hawaii. They lost to the Houston Outlaws in week 1. They've looked rough. They got taken to 5 mats by Atlanta Reign in the last week of the May Melee as well. Shock is a weird situation right now. Their supports look vulnerable. For the first time in a very long time, Violet's been picked off quite a few times. FD God has not settled into this team properly whatsoever. The change in playstyle that the Shock have to adapt to from Moth to FD God has not worked so far. Krusty has got a lot of work to do to mold that guy into the squad. Once he does, Shock will become better. But what you have to take into account is hero pools here. I think Shock are going to suffer for this because Reinhardt banned means Super is going to be much less effective. We have seen Super on the Winston during the May Melee, which is a rather surprise because we would expect Smurf to play most of the Winston. I think that's because most of the time they wanted to flex back to a Reinhardt. In that case, I think Super will probably play a lot less in the June Joust, and they will play a lot more Smurf. But thing is, the times we've seen Smurf during this May Melee, I haven't really been that impressed like I have been in previous seasons with Smurf. I think there's quite a few main tanks that are better than him right now. Mag, Jangu, for example. And so, where does Shock fit in? They've got supports that are not playing as well as they were. They've got a main tank that possibly isn't playing as well as they were. Joy Hoban is not standing out as much as he used to, possibly because the whole team is not as performing as well as it was. There's work to do at the Shock. There's a possibility that Shock bounce back entirely from this May Melee travesty that they've had, and pummel teams. There's also a possibility that it's going to take a little bit of grinding for Shock to get back to where they were. So that's why I'm putting them in 4th, because I don't entirely trust them to bounce straight back. In 3rd, we've got Houston Outlaws. I think Houston Outlaws will be fine with the metas, because we've seen Jangu be prolific on both Winston and Reinhardt, although Reinhardt is his favourable pick. That's why I've put Houston a little lower than perhaps people have expected, because Houston, they did end up losing out to Dallas in the end, and I think Houston are still a good team. They are much better than any of us expected, and I think they will still be up and around there. They could be just below Shock. It depends how Shock perform. It depends how Smurf comes in on that Winston or whatever we end up playing, and that'll be a heavy decider. Again, we don't know exactly what their teams will play, because Dive's going to be tough as well with no Zen and no Tracer, also no Sombra. So it's going to be quite tough to maintain Dive as well. So we could go double barrier, which again would be interesting for some teams, not going to lie. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. In 2nd, we have Washington Justice. Washington Justice, I think, will be consistently good. They did not make it to the May Melee Hawaii finals. They did slip up, but again, that's a learning curve because I think Washington shouldn't have lost to Florida. Florida activated beast mode in my opinion. They did really, really well. But I don't know whether Washington will make that mistake again. They've still got incredible players. Looking at like Decay and Assassin and people like that, and then you've got the tank line of Mag and Fury. They have just lost Rhea, but that's fine because he was not going to play. And then Bebe and Closer. It looks really good. And if we go into a dive meta, even if it's a little bit of a half-assed dive because there's no Zen, if you say it's an Anna Brig, that's the support line, that's still going to look incredibly good for Washington, I think. I think we will see quite a bit of Echo as well. Assassin needs to now live up on that Echo, I would say. And then we see a bit more, perhaps Ash or McCree from Decay or whoever may be playing it, Jerry as well, who also stepped up during this May Melee. I still think Washington are going to be very good, but I still don't think anyone can contest with Dallas, who are top of the standings right now, because Dallas have ascended. Dallas now have Pine, although Pine I think is more of a PR signing than anything else, because I don't think Dallas are going to play around Pine. Pine has not played for a year. Over a year. He's been out of the loop. Pine is a great mechanical player. I don't know how well he will come back to the league and play for Dallas. But it is a big brain signing because he is a massive name. and will sell shirts, merch. It's great for Dallas. It's a great PR move. But I still think we will see a lot of Doha and Sparkle play alongside each other, and Pine come in when they absolutely need a long-range hit scan. I don't think Pine is going to be an out-and-out starter for Dallas, because Dallas are going to play what they play best. And that's what they've been playing during this May Melee. It does mean they are going to suffer slightly. There's no Tracer, there's no Sombra. So that's going to be rough, and I think that's going to end up meaning we see a lot more long-range hit scans. I think if we do go dive, we will see Echo in a long-range hit scan. Either the McCree or the Ashe. Which means it's going to be tough for Sparkle unless he runs the Soldier 76, which he did in the May Melee final against Shanghai. It worked there. I don't know how much it will work in time. So Pine may be needed for that instance, for example. But then you also want Sparkle on the Echo. So in the June Joust, we could see more of Pine. I think, especially if we go dive, I expect Dallas to go dive. And in that case, Fearless Winston, we all know how good that is. Fearless is the best Winston in the league right now, without a doubt. Then you've got Hanbin, who's been great on the off tank. You've still got great supports in Fielder and Jexa with Repel to back them up, although I expect them to stick with Fielder and Jexa. I would be surprised if they switched that up after the success it's had. It's just very dependent on how Pine performs, especially if a long-range hit scan become very important during this June Joust, which could end up happening. So it will be interesting to see exactly how Pine fits into the Dallas Fuel, but I still think Dallas Fuel are going to be the team to beat. And therefore, for the first time ever, Dallas Fuel are top of the power rankings. And to be quite honest, if these were combined, Dallas Fuel would still be top of the power rankings. Out of all 20, Dallas Fuel would still be top. There's no way you can doubt this team right now, considering what they've been doing. They've been sweeping. And they've been cruising. I mean, look at the way they clutched out in the May Melee finals. And no one expected this team to do so well, considering the problems it had with XC coming into the season, and its performance in the next cup prior to the season, where they didn't look fantastic. And so, it tells you that preseason is to be taken with a pinch of salt. Dallas are the team to beat right now, and they are top of my power rankings. NA looks like this. Dallas, Washington, Houston, Shock, Florida, Gladiators, Toronto Defiant, Atlanta Reign, Boston Uprising, Paris, Eternal, Vancouver, Titans, and London Spitfire. It is going to be interesting to see what happens in the June Joust with the meta change. I expect the EU teams to suffer. I expect Dallas, Washington to benefit. Maybe Florida should benefit as well, maybe Gladiators. But Shock is going to be a big teller, so is Houston a little bit as well, to see just how they slot into this new meta. Defiant should do better as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It is literally next week. There'll be more content coming on the way, including a hero pool look as well, because we used to do those meta previews. They will be coming back for the June Joust. And yeah, super interesting. But for now, all of these socials are linked in the video description for Illusion Gaming and myself. Give them a follow, get on to joining the Discords and everything else. But for now, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you'd like to give a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.